every construction project is a mission, and you can define for yourself a purpose.
This is the Construction Veteran Podcast. Construction Veteran Podcast. Connecting and celebrating veterans in construction. Now, here's your host, Scott Friend.
Welcome back to the Construction Veteran Podcast. I'm Scott Friend, and I am stoked to bring you guys my friend Dan Sampson, a former Marine Corps helicopter pilot and current project manager in the construction industry. Let's dig into it. Hey, Dan, what's going on, man?
Hey, Scott, how are you?
I'm very good. I'm glad to have you on. So, Dan and I met at a monthly event here in the Dallas area called Bullets and Bourbon, ran by a former SEAL officer named Clint Bruce, which is actually an old friend of Dan. We'll get into that here in a little bit. So, Dan, I want to first dive in and talk about where you're from and what you did in the service.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Scott, thanks for having me on. Yeah, my name is Dan Sampson. I grew up here in Dallas, Texas. Graduated high school in 2008, and then went to the Naval Academy. Graduated there in 2012, and then spent 10 years in the Marine Corps, where I was a UH-1 Yankee helicopter pilot. Wrapped up my active duty time towards the latter part of 2022, and then came on board with Arco Murray, my current company, which is a national general contractor focusing in design build construction. And I work as a project manager.
So, Dan, I got to ask, when you go to the academy, so most people might know, but not everybody knows, you have the opportunity to go become a naval officer or Marine Corps officer. What was the decision on your part, why you went Marine Corps?
So I had actually known that I wanted to be a Marine for quite some time. So kind of like 5th or 6th grade. And I've tried to trace this back a couple times, and I'm not entirely sure how I arrived on the Marine Corps. Some combination of like a pretty serious Marine Corps recruiting effort, I'm sure. And then also kind of the esprit de corps that's associated to the Marine Corps. I think that was around the time that the guy in his dress blues, killing a dragon with a sword, that commercial came out.
Oh yeah.
If you're familiar.
Oh yeah.
Probably got its hooks into me pretty good. So that had been, a focus of mine for quite some time. And then in middle school, I struggled academically and ended up with a tutor for math who had attended the Naval Academy, and I kind of heard some stories and was like, man, that sounds really cool. And then between my 8th grade year and freshman year of high school, I ended up getting to go visit the Naval Academy for about a week during graduation week, which is quite the event and kind of gets you pretty fired up about it. And I was like, man, you can go to this really cool college and go be a Marine too. That sounds, kind of like the choice for me. So I was pretty dead set on that starting in high school. But the Marine Corps, substantially before that, I think it was, like I said, the esprit de corps and kind of the few the proud aspect of that, whether warranted or not at the time for a young 11-year-old was pretty motivating.
Oh, cool. So you thought you were going to be slaying dragons in dress blues?
That's correct. I did not get to do that. I know.
A bummer.
It was a bummer. But yeah, no, the Marine Corps career was awesome, and that esprit de corps was obviously on display and was where I belonged, I think. So it all worked out for the best. But yeah, no dragons. Never saw a dragon.
Very cool. So you mentioned you're a project manager. And so tell me, what is a project manager? If people don't know really in the construction side what you do, what would you say is like a typical day to day?
Yeah, I think so. So generally, and for those veterans that are looking into the AEC industry, you've got generally like two hemispheres of a construction project, and they're nominally called the field and the office. Your superintendent, which Scott, you're intimately familiar with that role. is basically running things in the field, and your project manager is supporting a superintendent and supporting the general course of construction and the best they can from the office. Inside our company, project managers have a pretty wide breadth of responsibilities, and that can range from any part of a construction project. So like my military brain wants to call that the left and right side of a construction project. But anything from estimating to getting into the actual weeds of a construction project. So managing contracts with owners, managing subcontracts with your different trade teams, dealing with things as they come up on site to provide as much administrative support as you possibly can, and then sometimes being a sounding board for your superintendent to bounce some ideas off, or providing your own directional ideas to project closeout, where you're managing the punch list and ensuring that you've got a satisfied and happy client at the end of the project. So a good amount of administrative support, a lot of managerial aspects to that job, and then at the end of the day, you're providing as much leadership as you think that you can, or is deemed appropriate for a project. Is something that goes a long way in motivating a team, is understanding that the project manager that is behind the desk is not always behind the desk and is on site, and it's tough to be mad at someone when you actually know them by name and by face.
Yeah, very well said, man. So I think there's a common misconception that like the superintendent works for the PM or vice versa.
Certainly.
How would you describe that relationship?
I think one of the the best ways to answer that question, especially with the audience that we have here, with veterans that are looking at the AEC industry, is like on my second day at Arco, I actually spent all day on site with a superintendent on a project that was probably, call it 60% complete or so. Prior to this, and Scott, you did a great job of digging into my background here, but I was a Marine helicopter pilot. There isn't it's not the Seabees. We weren't constructing things. In fact, if they saw pilots with tools, they usually told us to put them down, which I think is fair.
Yeah.
But I walked on this construction site day 2, and I started talking about the superintendent. And I, at the time, was generally unfamiliar with the roles of what a superintendent was and what a project manager was, and how those roles kind of interfaced. And I started to I sat down with the superintendent, and I basically just asked, like, hey, if you could build your perfect project manager, what would this project manager look like?
Good question.
Thank you. And he started to describe basically like someone that would support like the administrative functionalities of a superintendent and of the project in general. And as he was describing this, I was thinking in the back of my head, and it's not exactly, Scott, to your point, like the superintendent is not working for the project manager. The project manager and superintendent are working hand in hand. But I was reminded of like echoes of a staff NCO and like junior officer relationship, like specifically the good ones, right? The junior officers that are not pointing at the shiny stuff on their collar and saying like, we're going to do this because I went to college and that's what I said. And the staff NCOs that are willing to provide some left and right, lateral limits for their officers to support. Like at the end of the day, a good officer, as much as we don't like to believe it, is not a trigger puller, right? Like we're not the tactical arm. We are setting conditions for our trigger pullers to succeed. And I think of that, very similarly with a project manager and a superintendent. Like the superintendent is, your subject matter expert. They're the, SME if we want to use acronyms, but the project manager exists during the course of construction to set conditions for the superintendent and for the field team to succeed. And when you have two people that are operating with that relationship in mind, I think that the project is bound to succeed. When those two roles and responsibilities get reversed, I mean, you Scott, you saw it in the military all the time, and I'm only using that because I spent 10 years there. That's when things start to quote unquote come off the rails a little bit. Hopefully that kind of summates what I think about that relationship.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I appreciate that you took the time to ask that question as well, because I think there's a lot of different companies will have that animosity between the field and
Right.
the office. It's this, well, they don't know what they're doing, and it goes both ways. But when you kind of dig into each other's world a little bit, you realize,
Yeah.
well, I'm not really doing what I need to do to support this guy, and vice versa. So I appreciate you doing that with your super.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's the superintendent is the stake that a construction project rides on. Like it's in a good project manager and superintendent are going to work hand in hand, and the officer, staff, and CO, like hopefully that doesn't come across in the wrong way. Like that's those symbiotic relationships. The staff and CO is not working for the officer. As an officer, I really did not like that type of relationship. It's two people working on the same level. One is working to support the actual trigger pulling functionalities of the other, and support them in the best way they can. Set conditions for success, for your quote unquote trigger pullers.
Yeah, that's good. I'll share a quick story. I don't know if I've shared it on the post before, but I know, or the podcast before. I know I've told some friends, but when I went back in and I commissioned into the Army Reserves, we went out to the field, and I had another butter bar with me at the time, and he had no prior service. And the command sergeant major wanted us to wear our gear basically as soon as we stepped out of the tent. And this is
Right.
blazing hot outside. He's like, why do we have to do this? This is goofy. And can't I tell him I'm not going to do that because I'm an officer? I said, well, maybe on paper, but he's going to turn around and go to the battalion commander and say, you need to fix that officer.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of know your role type deal. So,
yep.
All right. So let me change here a little bit, change it up. What was it? Because you went from being a helicopter pilot and now you're in construction. How did that happen?
Yeah. So, probably a longer answer here than you're looking for, but,
no, man, the floor is yours.
Around so for me, I reached the 10-year mark. And that's about the time where everybody's deciding, is it it's kind of like your last chance. Like, is it time to leave, or are you going to ride it out for another 10 years? My wife and I had a bunch of conversations. My wife is absolutely wonderful and supported. At the end of the day, she was very frank and said, this is your decision to make. You lead our family in the way that you feel is the right way. I asked myself some pretty in-depth questions to arrive at the solution that it was time to, forgive the aviation pun, but punch out. And before I made that decision, or kind of like in concert with that decision, I started getting very aggressive on quote unquote networking, and it relatively tough to do when you're insulated, on whatever military base you're at, because I would be willing to bet there's a fairly good chance that location is geographically disparate from where you eventually want to end up. So I started, and Scott, we talked about it. I had wanted to be a Marine since I was in 5th grade. And then, get to the end of a 10-year career. I'm 32 years old. I've got a wife and a kid, and I have to decide what I want to do when I grow up, which is a tough decision to arrive at. So I started digging into just companies that I'd heard of, professions that I just like generally had heard of. I leveraged LinkedIn in a pretty big way, and it's something that I would advocate for veterans that are looking to get out. You can get a LinkedIn premium account for a 12-month time period for free if you're a military active duty member or a veteran, if you haven't done it previously. And I would look into companies and industries, and I would search for someone that had something in common with me. So three things generally come to mind, and that's, I was a Naval Academy graduate. That network's relatively strong. I was a Marine, and then I was a helicopter pilot. So I would look for someone in that company or industry that had something similar with me in common. So once I found that person, I would send them a message and ask for 30 minutes of their time to hop on a call and just hear their story, hear how the transition went, how they decided on the industry they were in. And that informed, it just gave me like a general background for how guys were, arriving in certain industries. Around that time period, I actually got connected to one of the partners at my current company via a friend from high school. We happened to be at a wedding together, and he kind of looked across the table, was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about project management?" And Scott, staff and COs, officers, like that's kind of like the go-to move for us getting out. And it was like the first thing you think of is project management. And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And he said that he wanted to connect me with one of our one of our partners. We hopped on a call, and I did some quick research on Arco Murray and what they did. So a decent amount of my family is in the construction industry, so I have some peripheral knowledge of it, not very in depth, but peripheral. I think the thing that impressed me the most, actually, or kind of like stuck with me the most, is I had 2 or 3 calls with different people in leadership positions at the Arco Dallas office, and I was immensely impressed with how forthcoming and intelligent, and the questions that they were asking. They were just, it was like, man, this feels to me a lot like a ready room feels, or a squadron feels, where you've got smart people that are driven and confident in themselves. And I was like, gosh, I'm looking for kind of a softer landing pad here, recognizing that I was going to lose some of that environment as I left the military. Kind of as those interviews progressed, like I never lost that feeling. If anything, it compounded, and then I ended up getting offered a position, and I didn't look back from there. For me, it was, I was actually drawn by the social environment of the company that I work at. Once we got into, and I got exposed to the construction industry, and I'm on our tenant solutions team. Industry term is tenant improvement. Generally, it's existing renovations of existing structures. Man, I loved it. And have loved it. It's, a construction project generally mirrors the operational planning cycle of the military, in the sense of, you've got a defined objective and you backwards plan. I know on a previous podcast you mentioned some lean planning principles, and it's this, you've got this defined objective, backwards plan from the defined objective in order to arrive at your end state. And a lot of times in the military, you've got this relatively nebulous end state of like, well, we'll capture and seize, and whatever the verbiage is there. But it's hard to be more concrete than a building, or like there's this is how we're gonna, this is what we're gonna do at the end of the day. Like, this is 100% of the product we're looking to turn over to the client. And I enjoy that type of planning. And then, the tenant improvement space is also very interesting. Scott, I think we've talked about it, and I think you've done some TI, but the man, like every building in the TI space starts as a mystery. It's trying to dig in and figure out, this building was built in 1930, and multiple iterations of contractors have been in there, and like, what did they do? What were they trying to achieve? Why is this here? Is really a fun and an enjoyable kind of, gosh, like brain exercise, right? And then not only how did it get there, why is it there, and how do we get it out, or what do we put in its place? That's very enjoyable.
Yeah, I agree with you that it's kind of like it's a pass fail, right? There's
Yep,
no in between.
100%.
We either delivered it or we didn't, and obviously there's changes along the way, and you have to be flexible with that. But it sounds like your story is really what I'm trying to impress upon people, that it's a fairly simple, not simple, I shouldn't say, it's a fairly seamless transition, if you will, going
Yep.
from the service into this industry, and there's a role for everybody, whether you are an ops leader and now you're the one planning it out, kind of like a project manager would be, or if you're the one running the troops in the field, like a
Yep.
superintendent.
No,
So
I 100% agree.
So what was it? I mean, you might have already answered this basically, but what was it that kind of kept you on this track? I mean, it seems like you just what you loved about the Marine Corps, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like what you loved about the Marine Corps and just that organization and the target goal is what you loved. Is that kind of what's kept you doing this, or what made you realize, when did you have that aha moment of, okay, I think I found my spot?
Yeah, great question. I would say to address this kind of separately, what I loved about the Marine Corps, flying a helicopter is awesome. In a word, I love that. The thing
It's
that
a humble brag, right?
yeah,
We all want to be helicopter
yeah,
pilots. That's awesome.
yeah. I'm surprised we made it like 2 minutes into the podcast before I said something about being a helicopter pilot.
Yeah.
This pilots, man. The thing that I loved about being being in the Marine Corps was I took a lot of pride in and really enjoyed being a Marine Corps, a Marine officer. And I would tell people, we would have, you got a friend of a friend who's, cousin is thinking about, joining the military because they want to be a pilot. And, one of the bigger questions I had for them relatively routinely is like, do you want to be a pilot, or do you want to be a Marine officer that flies? Because if you want to be a Marine officer that flies, you should join the Marine Corps. If you want to be a pilot, then perhaps think about another service. The Marine Corps is very good at impressing upon their leaders that, you're a Marine officer first, and then, your identity as a pilot comes second. So I I loved being in that role and providing as much, leadership and management and mentorship. Realistically, as a butter bar, you shouldn't be mentoring anybody without any prior service. But I enjoyed that a lot. The operational planning is, it was certainly part of it. Getting to construction, I agree with you. I think I don't, I think that construction AEC, I would say the C in construction is certainly a soft landing pad for veterans, right? Like you enter the environment, and it's not the same song, but it rhymes.
Yeah, I get you.
You've got, the first time I stepped on a construction site, I was like, man, there's all this stuff going on, and it doesn't make sense to me yet. But it's like a flight line. Like if I was to bring somebody to a flight line, they would just be like, man, this is chaos. How are helicopters not running into each other? And it's like, well, it's because because it's coordinated. And I recognize that, like, gosh, this is going to be, I think this is right. And then that furthers as you kind of go through the process. You've got, as a project manager, you're doing a lot of interdisciplinary leadership and management, right? You've got, especially when you're over the project as a general contractor, you've got, 10, 12, 20 trades that you're managing at any given point. And like that takes a lot of awareness of your own internal, like, management style, own internal leadership style, as well. And that all mirrored, what I had experienced in the military. When I left my last unit in the military, I was our operations officer, and military exercise planning, et cetera, it all has the same echoes in the construction industry. And the construction industry is a people forward business. It's a human business, and that's exactly what the military is. So because they matched and correlated, when you show up, you feel almost at home. Like this is an environment that I'm comfortable with. Yes, we're doing something new that I haven't personally experienced before, but like, man, once I get my feet underneath me, knowledge wise, like the structure is already existing.
Yeah, very good. So, man, this is a loaded question. But I want your opinion. How do you think your service, because you spent a fair amount of time in, you spent a decade in
Yeah.
serving. How do you think it's helped you the most in what you're doing now? I mean, there's a lot of crossover, I would say, especially with the
Yeah.
PM side. What do you
Yeah.
think that really sticks out to you? Like, oh man, I remember doing that in the Marine Corps.
I think it's kind of what we just talked about, Scott. I think it's it's finding the right blend of